Okay, it's a recording, and I can leave the word to Charles Tagliaferro, if I don't get wrong, who is the first one who speaks for the book launch of today.
All right, thanks to everybody for coming. This is quite an impressive group. If I haven't met you, I'm familiar with your names. This is rather intimidating to be providing the introduction, but first thing I might say, so my name is Charles Tagliaferro, teach at St. Olaf College, and Douglas has been a frequent visitor and speaker on our campus. So popular that some students made a tie with Douglas on it. So I'm wearing my Douglas Hedley tie, and you'll find a number of these in Minnesota. He's also with the Dalai Lama, so there's a little bit of a mix there, but in any case. I think the work that we're celebrating or launching today is quite extraordinary. It was, I should say, the seeds of this book were sown at a meeting at the University of Munster, which I attended. It was very stimulating, very engaging, and expanded in terms of contributors to the 8 writers engaging Douglas's trilogy, mostly from Europe, including Britain. And this text winds up being much along the lines of the Library of Living Philosophers. This is where you get to offer an intellectual autobiography. It's followed by papers of, shall we say, friendly critics, but some criticism nonetheless. And then the author is enabled to respond. And Christian Hengstermann has done just a really brilliant job of pulling this together. I've been told by a British friend, a philosopher, that when you're nervous addressing such a good group, sometimes you should make what you've written speak for yourself, have it do some work. And so I produce one of the endorsements for the work. So I'm going to read you my endorsement. A compelling case for the important contribution of the Cambridge Platonists to the history of ideas and their relevance for contemporary philosophy. Douglas Hedley's erudite work is well represented and critically engaged with by 7 outstanding scholars. Hengstermann is to be congratulated for this brilliant collection. So it's a little early in the day here in North America for me to lift the glass, but I say 3 cheers for this excellent work. Thank you to everybody. Over to the next person.
Yes.
Sorry, I had to unmute myself, sorry.
Yeah. So, yeah, thank you very much for your generous words. Charles, it was great to have you in Münster a few years ago. We need to do that again sometime in the future. Yeah. So I'm quite proud of this collection because I've known Douglas for some 10 years now, and it was a blessing in disguise when we invited an expert on Cambridge Platonism, and he very politely declined that invitation, suggesting one Douglas Hedley instead. And that was, as I've said, a blessing in disguise because we've done some extremely fascinating things together ever since, and we've heard the chimes at midnight several times as well. And everything that is great about Douglas's work is of course to be found in this trilogy of his. So he's the one to invite to conferences, obviously, especially when one is impressionable when it comes to to great English with lots of allusions to great thinkers and poets. Douglas is the man, I'd say, and this clearly shows in his trilogy. So the question is, why read this trilogy? And I'd say it's a pretty good read. So there's so much erudition in it, and there's so much of interest when it comes to this great tradition of intuitive insight into the divine. It's somewhat anachronistic in places, but there's this great idea that this is basically the ancient philosophy which has always had this intuitive awareness of something deeper, something that is more sublime than what generally meets the eye. You know? And metaphysics and methodology are, in a way, one in Douglas's work. So his approach to the intuition or the imagination as the medium whereby we can perceive the divine all around us within ourselves. This is actually applied to the whole of intellectual, literary, scientific history. All of this is paid justice to in his quest for the divine, and it's put forward in this very readable kind of way, with Douglas drawing on all these different sources to make a really strong case for man's capacity to gain insight into the divine. And there are many passages one could quote that basically encapsulate what this trilogy is about. But what I find striking and deeply characteristic of the author's work, personality, and his approach to the philosophy of religion is this idea that the world originates neither in necessity nor in freedom, but something in between. So we have that several times in this trilogy, right? Douglas rejecting two options that he finds equally unattractive, opting for a third that very few people had thought of before. And he says it all originates in play. So in Leela, as he says, drawing on Hindu sources as a concept of attempting to bridge two extremes, which also occur in Western theology, he says. Another thing that is great about Douglas's trilogy is the way he draws on Shakespeare, so the great metaphysical bard, as he calls him in his trilogy. And there are two passages in particular that I would like to focus on, just to give all of you an overview of what we have done in this essay collection on his trilogy. So the first one is what Douglas terms the ars poetica of the Romantic age, basically. The famous passage from Theseus' speech in A Midsummer Night's Dream, especially the passage focusing on the poet. The poet's eye in a fine frenzy rolling doth glance from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven, and his imagination bodies forth the forms of things unknown. The poet's pen turns them to shapes and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. So Douglas's imagination is basically man's capacity for the infinite, for God's own infinite fertility, productivity, as he ungrudgingly shares the riches of his own being with humankind and beyond, heaven to earth, from earth to heaven. This symbolizes the coincidentia oppositorum, of which man, by his amphibious nature, is capable, according to Douglas's work, which incorporates romantic, idealistic, and above all, Platonist traditions. He calls it an asymplastic power, that is a sort of fusion to force many into one. Or a favorite passage of his, taken from one of his most important sources, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, a repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation in the infinite I am. And this is what the imagination is about. It's the attempt, carried out in numerous exegeses of canonical texts, of canonical traditions, to spell out this first capacity man is defined by. It's the prime agent of all human perception. It's the pinnacle of the human mind, as well as its nadir. It contains all our intellectual and our volitional powers, as well as our most primordial instincts. And human life is all about storytelling, all about attempting to confer unity upon the plethora of things that we are, that we perceive, that we experience around us. And it is in this primordial, this original experience that defines us, that we also are given an inkling of what that original infinite nature is, God. And again, this knowledge of God is both cognitive and affective in character. So there's a long mediation on Rudolf Otto's classic masterpiece on religion, where Douglas, true to his German his deep German nature, right, reflects on that German word and understands it better than every native speaker. So, except for his Bavarian accent, right? So his German is of course extraordinary and comes in very handy in these contexts. And as a Platonist, he tries to spell out this infinity, and he does so in terms of three primordial symbols: the Phedrine chariot, the Jerusalem temple and the cross, and the heavenly city. And this is the triad of symbols that defines imagination as it seeks to understand itself and the world around it. And again, it's here in this context that Douglas draws on the great metaphysical bard, one of the greatest passages in Hamlet returning to Denmark, suddenly 10 years older than before and much wiser, and acquiescing in his sad fate with this extraordinary kind of transcendent happiness. There's a divinity that doth shape our ends, rough hew them how we will. And this is one of the fine leitmotifs of this trilogy, the idea that God informs the world via the images he shares with us. So the world is about the ascent of all reality to something higher, something deeper, that is ubiquitous, and that we are privy to because of our very nature. It is the very thing that enables us to have free choice, to engage with the world and without ourselves. It's the way God shares with us his own being. This is the triumph of the Phedrine chariot, which, interestingly enough, and again, this is something that really appeals to me when it comes to the tragedy, and something that we stress in the essay collection on Douglas's work. He combines this Platonist notion with Shakespeare and with Kant and Plato. So we've got all those worthies subscribing to the idea of homoiousis theo and the idea of a true self that we can't lose because of our original participation in the divine. However, Douglas's is not an entirely or exclusively optimist vision of reality. It embraces the idea that the tragic is part of reality. And again, he draws on Shakespeare the idea that people, tragic heroes like Macbeth, for instance, evidence the greatness of man in their very downfalls, the way they trespass, the way they suffer. And it's one of the most intriguing proofs of God's existence offered in the whole trilogy, that the pain we feel in a way proves the existence of something greater, because otherwise we couldn't really wrestle with the conundrum that is pain and suffering. It's a visceral soul-making theodicy delineated in the second volume of the trilogy. But the trilogy ends in music, and since this is a joyous occasion, this is certainly something, the note to end on, basically. So the way Romeo, for instance, at the end of Shakespeare's great second tragedy, talks about Juliet in the Capul's monument. Her beauty makes this vault a feasting presence full of light. And Douglas draws on Shakespeare time and again, explaining how music brings about a transformation of the soul after it has experienced both the wheel of the chariot and the woe of the Jerusalem temple, the sacrifice. And this is what this trilogy of works points to in the end, something that we've stressed a lot with regard to the many sources he draws on, the many other concepts of the religious imagination Douglas's trilogy reacts to. This is what man is called upon to attain in the end, the fullness of this beauty, which he cannot doubt because it's part of his very nature, of his very makeup. And it's a book that I'm I'm really happy to present here. And thank you, Douglas, for all our joint work. And I'm really happy that that I've been able to edit this book. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And if I don't get wrong, now is Benedict's Goke turn from Oxford, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, very good. So first of all, so what I like in particular about the work of Douglas is that he somehow manages to bring together elements from analytic philosophy with elements from continental philosophy on the one hand, and on the other, he always tries to look for cross-cultural relations to other philosophical traditions, like, for instance, those in India. And reading the trilogy, I also was often reminded of Kashmir Shaivism, and also the work of Timothy Sprigge, if I pronounce that correctly. So today I'd like to say a few words on panentheism, and on the panentheism entailed in the trilogy, or whether it is entailed or whether not, maybe is something for further discussion. So according to Christian Hengstermann, quote, "The God of the iconic imagination is a panentheist deity who is at once a consummate intellect of paradoxical simplicity that transcends the world, and the latter soul that is immanent to it and animates its every part, however minute. Creating all things from the fullness of his own being in the beginning, he is perfect goodness, ungrudgingly sharing with nature and man his own vision of the good, the true, and the beautiful in the three tautogorical symbols of the iconic imagination, and thereby gradually guiding the whole of creation towards its restitution in the end." End of quote. Panentheism is an all-encompassing metaphysical theory that differs from theism in that the world is not conceived as an ontological counterpart of the ultimate ground of the world. An important argument for conceiving of the world as a counterpart of the ultimate ground of the world is that the ultimate ground of the world is an infinite divine reality that would be limited in its infinity and therefore deprived of its divinity by a world that would exist apart from it. A world existing outside the divine essence would, from the point of view of panentheism, lead to a duality of God and world, in which both God and the world would have to be thought of only as finite entities, as mutually limiting, and thus as distinct from the absolute. Panentheism differs from pantheism in that the world is not ontologically identified with divine reality per se. An important argument for the distinction between the world and the ultimate ground of the world is that the world cannot exist by itself, since at every moment of its existence, it needs an ontological ground of its existence, distinct from itself, to hold it in being. And this ground can only be the divine reality. Thus, while panentheism differs from theism in that it specifies the concept of divine reality as an all-encompassing and infinite reality, and therefore rejects the theistic assumption of an ontological separation between God and world, it differs from pantheism in that it assumes that the existence of the world cannot be explained out of itself, and that it therefore needs an ultimate ground of its existence. Against this background, the core thesis of panentheism is a thesis dialectically mediating between theism and pantheism, that while the world is to be understood ontologically as part of the all-encompassing divine reality, the divine reality cannot be reduced ontologically to the being of the world. The thesis that the world is a genuine part of divine reality leads to an interesting image of the divine being itself. The divine being in panentheism can be considered in itself and as such. If, on the one hand, the divine reality is considered as such, it is considered as the one infinite and unconditioned being that exists outside of time and space and necessarily possesses the properties that determine its nature. These properties include not only that the divine reality is not subject to external influences and is not dependent in its existence on anything different from it, but also that its existence as a being, as a maximally perfect being, is intrinsically good. It is roughly that part of panentheism that agrees to a huge extent with scholastic metaphysics and its conception of God as pure act, as actus purus, the best argument for the existence of which is still to be found in the angelic doctors De Ente et Essentia. If, on the other hand, the divine reality is considered in itself, insofar as it is thought to be distinct from the world as its cause, and at the same time to be permanently related to it as its source of being, then it becomes apparent not only that the categorical features of the world are determinations of the intrinsic being of the divine reality, they are not external to the one infinite principle, but also that the history of the world cannot be without consequences for the all-embracing divine reality as such. Since in panentheism, the history of the world is conceived as part of the history of the divine reality itself. The history of the world in panentheism is either a part of or the inner life of God itself or himself. The theoretical challenge now of a panentheistic theory of the absolute is to think together both seemingly irreconcilable perspectives on divine reality and to answer the question how it can be that the divine reality on the one hand is unchangeable, eternal, and maximally perfect, while on the other hand, it is the active cause of a world whose development itself has an impact on the absolute as such. It is therefore necessary to conceptualize the space and the degree in which divine reality can allow itself to be determined by the world. As Klaus Müller puts it, quote, panentheism implies something like a non-inconsequentiality of the world and the finite for God as such. The world transcending self-identity of God does not exclude a determinateness of God by the universe. End of quote. When it is assumed that the history of the world has an impact on the eternal self-identity of the absolute as such, then we can spell this out in more detail based on one of Douglas Hedley's insights. According to Douglas, the following holds, quote, if God's nature is love, and it is God's nature to communicate that love, this is a form of necessity. It is a necessity grounded in the divine essence. It is intrinsic to God. Insofar as it is not extrinsic to God, we can say that this manifestation of love is an act of self-determination. End of quote. If this is indeed the case, then the divine communication of love in which the world is grounded at once is also a communication of libertarian freedom on any level of finite existence, because it is impossible to communicate love without libertarian freedom. If the existence of the finite world is grounded in divine love, then the existence of the world is the existence of a free world. If that manifestation of divine love, as Hedley says, furthermore is an act of self-determination of the absolute, then it follows that Hedley, at least implicitly, is committed to the panentheistic thesis sketched by Klaus Müller, that the divine being in unconditional and eternal freedom decided to let its essence be co-determined in and by the history of a free world. In panentheistic thinking, the temporally unfolding history of the universe as a grand narrative, as a cosmic history, is thus that which in difference and relatedness to the divine reality as its ground of being has always already co-determined the all-encompassing divine reality. To be clear, since this unconditional act of freedom grounding in the love which is God's nature implies that the history of the world itself must be determined by freedom, if otherwise the divine reality could not let itself be freely co-determined by the history of the world. And since freedom presupposes a minimum of consciousness, it also follows that according to this kind of panentheistic thinking, which I see in Douglas' work, on the one hand, freedom is a property of finite beings of the universe to be found on all ontological levels, and on the other hand, a rudimentary consciousness in the sense of panpsychism is omnipresent in the universe as well. Since freedom in the panentheism outlined here is not indifferent choice between different options, but is conceptually understood as freedom to realize the good, the true, and the beautiful, it further follows that the divine reality wants to be co-determined by the free realization of the good, the true, and the beautiful in the world. Although it sounds paradoxical at first that the loving divine reality wants to let itself be co-determined in and by the world as part of itself in its being, because we are accustomed from monotheistic thinking to think the eternal and necessary being of divine reality independently of the finite world. This supposed paradox can be resolved if the perspectives on the divine being are kept apart as clearly as possible. Whereas from the temporal perspective, the development of the universe as part of the divine reality is in itself an open and free system which can develop in the future in quite different directions. From the atemporal perspective of the divine reality, it is yet already, je immer schon, as Heidegger probably would have said, decided which development this universe will have taken and how it has co-determined the eternal and necessary nature of divine reality. It is therefore no contradiction that a proposition about what is future from our temporal perspective is atemporally true, although that which makes it true from the temporal perspective lies in the future. The limits of the co-determination, and I'm coming slowly to an end, the limits of the co-determination of the divine reality are drawn in panentheism, where the question of the intrinsically positive value of the divine reality as the cause of the existence of the world is affected. Since freedom is not an indifferent choice between different options, but is understood conceptually, this is how I understand Douglas also, in panentheism as freedom for the realization of the good, true, and beautiful, it follows first of all that the divine reality wants to be co-determined by the free realization of the good, true, and beautiful in the world. Since divine reality, as the ground of the existence of the world in which the good, true, and beautiful are to be realized, must also give this world the possibility of realizing the good, true, and beautiful in it. And since divine reality can guarantee this possibility only if it is itself the good, true, and beautiful towards which the world is directed, it follows further that no cause of the world can diminish the intrinsically positive value of divine reality as the intrinsically true, good, and beautiful. Although it may be the case, and in a longer paper we could now reflect on the problem of evil, so although it may be the case from a panentheistic perspective that in a world whose history is to be interpreted at each level of its constitution as a history of freedom, the freedom given to finite living beings in panentheism can be abused, and it can fail to achieve the goal of realizing the good, the true, and the beautiful. However, even the worst history of the world cannot trump the intrinsically positive value of divine reality in itself, even though divine reality, in its decision to allow itself to be always already co-determined by the world in its essence, has taken the risk that suffering and the abuse of freedom, the possibility of which is also to be thought of as a component of divine reality in itself, may be part of divine reality. From a pantheistic perspective, and this is how I understand Douglas' work, the divine reality, to speak metaphorically, has given itself into the world, into the history of the world, in order to be able to receive itself from it in freedom, despite the risks it involved. Because the world is nothing over and above the divine life, the God of pantheism, thus is the true metaphysical Emmanuel. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And now I shall leave the word to Thomas Sanke. I think you asked me to share the screen.
Yes.
I make you co-host. So
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much for having me. It's a great privilege and pleasure to speak to you on this happy occasion of the book launch. Indeed, I have prepared a PowerPoint presentation I'd like to share with you. So I hope it's working. So I've chosen a famous phrase from German literature as title for my contribution. It is the opening sentence of Thomas Mann's masterpiece, Joseph and His Brothers. This work of literature consists of 4 volumes, and it is one of the finest manifestations of imagining religious imagination. It is more than adequate, I think, to refer to this work in order to pay homage to Douglas Hedley's trilogy on religious imagination, which provides the background for the volume edited by Christian Hengstermann and launched today. Tief ist der Brunnen der Vergangenheit. Very deep is the well of the past. I have linked this quotation from Thomas Mann to the claim that I like to talk about Douglas's very own philosophy. Some hasty critics might think that it is quite impossible to descend into the well of the past and to establish a very own philosophy as well. They might think such a way of doing philosophy is doomed to fail. On the contrary, it is not. This is my firm belief. I think it is not inappropriate to quote the learned Dr. Cudworth in this instance. In the preface to his True Intellectual System of the Universe, he famously states, quote, "We were necessitated by the matter itself to run out into philology and antiquity. We do often give an account of the doctrine of the ancients, which, however, some over-severe philosophers may look upon fastidiously or undervalue and depreciate. Yet, as we conceived it, often necessary, so possibly may the variety thereof not be ungrateful to others. And this mixture of philology throughout the whole sweeten and allay the severity of philosophy to them." End of quote. We were necessitated by the matter itself to run out into philology and antiquity. Thus, it is more than just a personal interest or a didactical tool. It is the necessity of the issue in question. For Cudworth, philosophy is like a living organism. His philological and historical method is due to the insight that philosophy, that is reasoning and imagining, have their history, their unfolding, their blossoming. For this reason, he cannot proceed in geometrical order like Spinoza or Hobbes. He must run out into philology and antiquity to make his point, which is about freedom, both human and divine. Cudworth is an excellent example how the descent into the well of the past leads to the establishment of a very own philosophy, which he achieved with his True Intellectual System and his other writings. I suppose we all agree on that. And what is true about the learned Dr. Cudworth, it is true about the learned Dr. Hedley as well. He does descend into the well of the past. He does run out into philology and antiquity, but far from distracting him from doing philosophy, this method makes Douglas the very philosopher who he is. I like to come back to the quotation from Thomas Mann in order to say more about Douglas's philosophy. Tief ist der Brunnen der Vergangenheit. Very deep is the well of the past. Should we not call it bottomless? Bottomless indeed, if and perhaps only if the past we mean is the past merely of the life of mankind, that riddling essence of which our own normally unsatisfied and quite abnormally wretched existences form part, whose mystery, of course, includes our own, and is the alpha and omega of all our questions, lending burning immediacy to all we say and significance to all our striving. This sumptuous first paragraph of Mann's novel goes on a little further, ending up on a rather skeptical note. No one will ever reach the bottom of that well. Our imagination deceives us, and what we get hold of from time to time turns out to be nothing but illusion. One could argue, however, that Mann, in writing Joseph and his brothers, did a great deal to confute that kind of skepticism himself. But let's leave this question to it. Let's turn to Douglas's work instead, in which he definitively achieved a robust theory of religious imagination by the very means of descending into the deep well of the past, collecting, reconstructing, meditating, and giving his readers the opportunity to follow him on his path. No doubt, each and every one of us is a Rätselwesen, as Mann puts it. Contemplating ourselves, we are puzzled by the riddling essence of mankind, as Lowie Porter translates. Many attempts to escape this fact of our riddling essence have been made in recent years. The mainstream of materialist reductionism, overwhelmingly present in many philosophy departments, is obviously one of them. At the other end of the spectrum, we encounter various kinds of fideism, may come in a traditionalist or in a modern or postmodern shape. It is Douglas's adamant intention to provide an alternative to those currents. Only in rejecting both massive naturalism and rampant supernaturalism, we can see clear about the human condition. What is the human condition like? The English translation of Mann confronts us with our own normally unsatisfied and quite abnormally wretched existences. The original text hints also at the natural and the supernatural dimensions of our lives, both of them irreducible. It is literature, it is myth and religion. It is indeed life, which educates us by means of imagination, who we really are, and how the structure of the world we live in is understood best. As Douglas puts it, quote, "If virtue and vice, good and evil, justice and tyranny relate to the fabric of the universe, moral and spiritual facts are as much a part of the universe as particles and waves." I'd like to stress three aspects of this idea. Imagination is different from illusion. Motives drawn from the deep well of the past, of our individual and our collective memory, can represent their own reality in a symbolic manner. Douglas combines Jung's psychology of archetypes with the notion of the tautogorical, borrowed from Schelling and Coleridge. While allegory utterly separates sign from meaning, image from reality, the tautogorical symbol, I quote, "symbol is a vivid and instantaneous disclosure of a higher truth in a lower medium." As I said, I reckon that Mann was closer to tautogorical imagination than to allegorical skepticism in the end, writing Joseph and his brothers. This applies, of course, even more to scripture itself, for example, and to the long tradition of Platonism, Kabbalah, and mysticism. Reflecting on the importance of imagination is not a plea for non-cognitivism or irrationalism. As Douglas points out, it is rather about finding reason in the various ways human beings express themselves through history. Perhaps a wider conception of reason is needed in order to meet the standards of such a view. However, it is definitively far from non-cognitivism, since it entails a proper metaphysics. Finally, reflecting on the importance of imagination is not a sort of escapism. On the contrary, it is beneficial and helpful for leading one's own life. Douglas's magnificent and detailed analysis of the symbols of the chariot, the temple, and the city shows the commitment to anagogic growth, empathy for the tragic, and a good sense for joy and the beautiful. I'm sure that the book launched today will contribute a great deal to the debates on religious imagination. It explores and celebrates the method, the manner, and even the art of Douglas Hedley, who knows to unveil how deep and how fecund of the past really is. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. And now I think that we are coming to our closing words. And Kevin Corrigan, the stage is yours. Kevin Corrigan disappeared.
No, I'm here.
Ah, okay. Hey.
I forgot after all this Zoom to unmute myself.
No worries, I couldn't find you. Okay, the stage is yours. Sorry.
I just want to attempt to bring this to a close with a few remarks, since I don't exactly have a prepared account here. I want first of all to thank Douglas for, and you all, for making this possible. What a strange species we belong to, something that I think we have discovered poignantly in the course of this particular year. And I think what Douglas brings is, of course, first, the possibility of a different way of imagining the world in which we live. And God knows how important that is for every single generation. Secondly, in the spirit of Platonism and Christian Platonism, he brings the spirit of friendship. Anyone who knows Douglas knows that he has this capacity not only to think across different lines, east and west, up, down, diagonally, but also to make people comfortable in his presence. And he certainly brings the gift of friendship. Therefore, I want to thank Douglas, first of all, for enabling us to think outside the cave, and secondly, for the spirit of friendship that he has brought to us. As I've listened to the inspiring words of our speakers today, I just couldn't help thinking of Plato's Philebus, how that which is inseparable from itself can yet be seen in everything. Or much later in a thinker like Evagrius, who really espouses both the heights and the depths of everything. After all, he's about to die 399 before Theophilus of Alexandria will rid out the desert of all those troublesome monks. And Evagrius has that wonderful line, "The Holy Spirit visits us even when we are impure and broken." And when I think of this particular year, and particularly what Douglas has had happen in this particular year, I just think this is one of the central mysteries and one of the central features of life, which is in fact not an illusion, anything but an illusion, but something essential for life if we are not to live in a pig's trough, which is all too readily our fate otherwise. And finally, of course, I can't help thinking of Dionysius, the divine names. The divine thearchy, without departing from its superessential goodness, is led down to everything, to be enchanted by everything. So it's just my response, particularly to the remarks, I think, of Benedict today. I want to end by simply quoting Douglas himself. At the end of his book on the iconic imagination, his final paragraphs are certainly worth quoting. "The greatest philosopher of the Western tradition was a poet. He gave us the cave of his republic and wrote in the Phaedrus about the super-celestial place of which none of the earthly poets have sung." And then, of course, he's given us a conspectus of his trilogy, and here he refers to living forms of the imagination, started with the Phaedrian chariot as an image of the power of the imagination to bridge becoming and being. The imagination is needed in art to reconcile the eternal with the characteristics of one's own age. Transcendence is requisite for the operation of the religious imagination, with its sense of the enigmatic, symbolic, and yet complex and indivisible totality of the world. And then later, he cites Pasternak, quite delightfully on the final page. I'm so glad to see that, and you cite a crucial passage, in fact, from Dr. Zhivago, but I cannot cite it here. Let me go to the very end of your work. Why is the book of Revelation paradigmatic? In the Ezekiel image, we observe the ambivalence of the chariot. Is it moving up or down? Is it imagination or revelation? In Revelation 4 and 21, we have the divine theophany as both an upward and a downward movement. The image of the heavenly door to the Lamb is an image of ascent. The image of the bride or city is one of descent. In the fusion of the images of ascent and descent, the imaginative theophany of Revelation is a unity of upward and downward movement. And the content of the vision is motion and rest, life and stillness, feast, contemplation, and song. Implicitly, Douglas finishes with the Phaedrus, feasting and the heavenly place and the movement up above the heaven to the heavenly place itself. Today, I'd just like to thank all of you because we are here in the intellectual spirit, the world of the imagination, which God knows that we need, which again has been given to us by Douglas. Douglas, congratulations, and congratulations for the spirit of intellectual and spiritual friendship, which invigorates and animates us all.
Thank you very much for your closing words. And maybe Professor Hedley wants to add something.
I would just like to thank everybody for taking part in this, and particularly to the editor of the volume, to Christian, and Yes, and thank you, Clelia, for hosting today's meeting.
No worries. Thank you for the occasion. Thank you very much. And I don't know, actually, since this is a book launch, I don't know if it is a moment for a Q&A or something, or a discussion or something like that. Usually, since I'm hosting interviews and lectures and whatever, this is the moment for a Q&A. But I don't know, since this is a book launch, if someone wants to add something, whatever, we have our other 30 minutes. So feel free to add something. Yes, please.
Will the recording be accessible afterwards?
YouTube, our YouTube channel, the Cambridge Center for the Study of Platonism, as a YouTube channel. Just type on YouTube, Center for the Study of Platonism. There are no other Center for the Study of Platonism on YouTube.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Oh. Okay, I think that since I don't think there are other interventions or something like that, so I would like to thank again all the speakers, Professor Charles Tagliaferro, Benedict Gauck, and the other speakers, and thank you very much for all the presence, all this audience. And thank you, Professor Douglas, and I will let you know by sharing it on the website when the video will be available on YouTube. And thank you very much for everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Congratulations.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Thank you.